They are the players that disrupt games and offensive game plans. They get into the backfield, they bring down runners from the backside, they rush the backside of the quarterback, and they cause havoc. Defensive linemen, the ends and the linemen that stuff the run in the middle. We talk about the top 5 in the ACC, and we'll probably get to more than just the top 5. We bring in Dan Rubin of BC Interruption, Jeff Greenberg of Sports Glut, and we've got Jim Hammett, Cardiac Hill, Pitt's SB Nation platform, and also Joey Weaver from the Rumble seat, also of SB Nation, talking Georgia Tech sports. All right, Dan, we're going to lead off with you this time. Let's talk about the big guys up the middle and those DNs coming off the edge.
Well, my list is going to be pretty much 2 teams plus a Syracuse guy, which for the fact that I'm picking a Syracuse guy shows I don't know what it shows, but it's probably not a good thing if I'm picking anybody from Syracuse this year. But I'll get to that in a little bit. My number 5 pick is Ken Ekanem from Virginia Tech. He's a guy that he's great at disrupting game flow. He had almost 15 tackles simply for losses. He had 50-plus tackles last year, just under 10 sacks. Might be the best defensive lineman in the league, but I think that he draws a little bit less attention given his counterpart at Virginia Tech, Dadi Nicolas. And, when you look over at that lineup, you have 2 just complete nasties on the defensive line. But I'm taking him number 5. He could easily be a number 1 defensive end anywhere, though, and will probably play on Sundays once he's done. Number 4, I'm going to go up to New York's college team up in upstate Western New York, up at Ron Thompson up at Syracuse. I'm trying to think of every possible way I can crap on Syracuse right now, so I'm just going to talk about Ron Thompson because he is so good on a team that is going to be pretty bad this year. He's great at, again, disrupting. He had 2 forced fumbles, was 26th in total defense last year. Syracuse was. He's a big part of that. He's a solid player coming off the end. Like I said, Syracuse, they're going to be in for a rough season this year. They're facing a lot of an uphill battle. A lot more uphill than they've had in recent memory, and they're in for a bad year if they can't get it together offensively. But a guy like Thompson defensively is a guy that really I've taken note of and just wanted to get some mentioning out there. Number 3, I had Sheldon Rankins from Louisville, another guy, 50-plus tackles, 14 tackles for loss. He's a huge guy to be playing defensive end, too. Listed 6'2", he's a 300-pounder. They had him on the end. I believe he might have been recruited as a D tackle, but I know he had him unlisted on some of the lists that I saw as defensive ends. So I was thinking, does he belong on this list? Does he not belong? Everyone says he's a defensive end. I haven't watched a ton of Louisville though, so I put him on the list at number 3. My number 2 guy, I'm staying with Louisville, and that's Devontae Fields. Devontae Fields is a beast. He's the 2012 Defensive Player of the Year as a true freshman in the Big 12. He was a potential first-round pick, probably should be in the NFL this year, but then he ran into all of his problems at TCU. He ran into his injury in 2013. He ended up redshirting this year, got kicked off the team and played for Trinity Valley Community College, ran into some issues, but he's back and he's in the ACC. He had 10 sacks, 19 tackles for loss as a freshman. He's a guy that's going to be playing with an edge. He's appreciative for that opportunity. And speaking of second chances, who better to play for than a guy like Bobby Petrino, the king of second chances? A guy like Devontae Fields is going to wreak havoc on the ACC. And my number 1 guy is Dadi Nicolas from Virginia Tech. 9 sacks. He's 6'4", 236 pounds. Had 9 tackles in the bowl game against Cincinnati. 9 tackles against Virginia. Had 2 sacks in a win over Ohio State. 2.5 sacks and 9 tackles against Duke in a win. He's a guy that he's just a mammoth human being who is nearly impossible to block. Best bet, go the other way and get away from him.
Yeah, you can be sure that Urban Meyer knows who Nicholas is, along with his running mate Corey Marshall. Had a big game against Ohio State, and of course that upset win in Columbus. And you bring up Devontae Fields, and you ran down the freshman year in the Big 12. He was so good as a freshman that he was the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year as a freshman. So, yes, he is something special. All right, Jeff, well, we're talking D-line. Who do you have for the top 5?
I'm impressed with Dan's. He got to go first, so he's excited about the Devontae Fields pick out of the blue. So that was a good one if you weren't paying attention to all the off-field transfers and whatnot in the ACC. That's a good pick there. My number 5 is a guy out of Clemson named Shaq Lawson. I think I picked him, yes, for his ability, but just because there's always going to be someone from Clemson coming on that line that's going to be outstanding. With the other guys graduating, I think it's his time. He's a junior, had about 8 sacks, 22 tackles for loss over the last 2 years. It's his line now. A lot of pressure is going to be on him, but I think he's got the talent to make some noise, and I think Dabo's proven right now that Clemson's not in rebuilding mode every year. They're just reloading. A number 4 guy, and I may butcher this name, but it's the Aussie out of Georgia Tech, Adam Gotsis. I think he is somebody that's going to be big for Georgia Tech. I think we just talked about earlier with the running backs that a lot of questions to be answered on offense outside of the quarterback position. The defense was very underrated last year, and I think Mississippi State found that out. I think a lot of teams did. But I think coming back this year with more help, he's going to be one of the big guys that helps him. He was a second-team All-ACC guy. He will be playing on Sundays. I think he's going to be a big factor for them on defense if they're going to have success this year down in Atlanta. Number 3, out of Louisville, Sheldon Rankins. Dan just went over his stats, over 50 tackles, 9 sacks, about 14 tackles for loss. I think what's going to be big for him this year is having Fields on the line with him, where last year he might have been someone they game planned for. They may try that this year, but they're not going to be able to focus on Rankins when they have Fields coming too. I think he's going to benefit from having that extra freak next to him, and he's going to have a big year as well. And then when you get to talking about that, how multiple guys on the line are going to help with each other, I moved to the 2 guys from Virginia Tech. 3 of you add Marshall. He's on my honorable mention list. But first is Econom, 50-plus tackles, about 10 sacks, 15 tackles for loss, as Dan said. I think he's just a beast. But the reason these guys are on this list, too, is the fact that they're playing with guys next to him, like my number 1 guy, Dadi Nicolas, over 70 tackles, 9 sacks himself. So you're looking at 2 guys right there that had almost 20 sacks between them, almost 33 or 34 tackles for loss between those 2 guys alone. Nicolas is, based on his health, if he's healthy, should have a very big year. Is projected to be a 2nd or 3rd round pick, but a huge year could throw him into the 1st round. So my top 2 guys, both from Virginia Tech, are Hokies, and I would say Marshall, their running mate on the defensive line, would also be in my honorable mention list.
Yeah, you mentioned Clemson needing to get somebody from the defensive line because they've been really strong there for the last few years with Grady Jarrett and with Vic Beasley. And if you watch the NFL Combine, it seemed like Clemson had like 18 defensive linemen there, or at least front 7 players, extremely strong, and we'll see if they can retool up front on defense. All right, Joey, your defense is coming back pretty well there at Georgia Tech. Should be very strong this season. What do you see along the ACC lines at defensive line?
Sure. So maybe a little bit of a stronger, coming on a little stronger than usual defensive line-wise at Georgia Tech. Not traditionally a big-time school in that area, but I think this year they're going to be pretty good. I don't know if I want to call it my honorable mention, but a guy to keep an eye on is Jabari Hunt-Days at Georgia Tech. He's a 4-star recruit. His brother was Sinjin Days, the running back last year, who did really well towards the end of the year. He started out as middle linebacker, again, 4-star recruit, played pretty well, mainly in the 3-4 that Al Groh had installed. Last year was suspended for academic reasons, and this year is set to come back. He's grown all the way from about 245 pounds. I think they said he's about 290 now. He's playing defensive tackle. Last year, Shaq Mason, who was the offensive lineman the Patriots drafted, said that Hunt-Days was the best defensive lineman that he played against all year long. And that includes some of the guys from Clemson, some of the guys from Virginia Tech, etc. So he's a guy to keep an eye on. He's never, played defensive tackle, on TV like this, but certainly a lot of Tech fans very, very hyped about what he might be able to do. So I'll go down the list, starting with number 5 again. I've got Dadi Nicolas there. I know a lot of guys have had him at number 1, number 2. He probably honestly should be at like number 2, but I just feel guilty about putting 2 Virginia Tech guys at the top. Number 4 is a guy that Jeff mentioned, was Adam Gotsis at Georgia Tech. He is a guy that didn't have huge numbers from that defensive tackle position, but is a guy that really did his job extremely well. He was dealing with a lot of double teams, didn't have a ton of great performance and production around him, but hopefully with another guy inside and, again, some continued development of some of the defensive ends that were younger, he should be able to have maybe more of a breakout season. I think the cool thing about him is he's about 6'5", and he's listed at 280, 285, and the guy is amazingly trim for that kind of a frame. I think he's about got a six-pack, so a lot of room to continue growing if need be. Number 3, I got Sheldon Rankins at Louisville. You've heard some of the stats. He was, I think, the third most sacks in the ACC of returning players, whereas Nicolas, I mentioned before, is number 2 of returning players. Number 2, I really thought I was going for a curveball, and is a guy that both guys already have mentioned, is Devontae Fields. Thought I was going to be clever and have him in there, but as it turns out, other people know about him too. Definitely really, really interested to see what he's going to do in the ACC. Amazing production as a freshman, years ago for TCU, but I think a guy that really could wreak a lot of havoc in that Atlantic Division and with some of the other matchups. And last but not least, number 1, Ken Eckenham up at Virginia Tech. Again, I think he and Nicolas may very well be 1-2. He leads returning players in the ACC with 10.5 sacks last year. That was second in the conference, only to Vic Beasley. I really think that he and Nicolas are going to be an absolute terror on that defensive line at Virginia Tech. But yeah, I'm going with some of the same guys that have already been mentioned.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think that it was back in 2012, as I count back the years, that Fields was tracking down Le'Veon Bell in the bowl game, Buffalo Wild Wings Bowl against Michigan State. So he's been off the field for 2 years in terms of big-time play, and now he reemerges here in the ACC. All right, Jim is very well rested, I think, at this point, and I'm going to wait and listen to the top 5 list, and then I'm going to point one thing out that I've noticed here. All right, Jim, what do you have for us?
Well, my list is very Virginia Tech heavy, like everyone else. But to start my list, I kind of went off the board from everyone else. I went with Luther Matty, senior defensive tackle. Injured a little bit last year, but has 21 career starts to his name, kind of that space eater defensive tackle. Third team All ACC 2 years ago. So I think he's going to come back strong from an injury, and he would kind of just play into that Virginia Tech defensive line. 4, I'm going to go with Gotsis from Georgia Tech, second team All ACC. Last year, kind of a space eater, good anchor for that Georgia Tech defensive line. 3, I'm going to go with Shaq Lawson from Clemson. I really that pick's based more on potential and what he can do. 7.5 career sacks at Clemson, and with Beasley gone, like the guys we mentioned that are moving on, I think he's going to step into that role and really take on the leadership role of the Clemson defensive line. And 1-2, interchangeable 1A, 1B is Ekman and Nicolas from Virginia Tech. I mean, like you said, 9 sacks for one, 9.5 sacks for the other. They just cause so much havoc, but I do feel a little guilty having 3 Virginia Tech guys up there.
All right, good stuff, Jim. How many times do you think, since Florida State has joined the ACC, that we would do a top 5 defensive line list and not have anyone from Tallahassee? Don't think that would happen too often. So that's one thing I noticed there. Anybody else off the radar? Anyone in your particular programs that you like? I know, Jim, that we talked some spring football a couple months ago, and you really don't lose too much anywhere. A couple linebackers on defense that were productive, and offensive linemen. So how's the defensive front look there at Pitt?
I think a breakout candidate possibly is sophomore Rory Blair. He's a local kid, and he actually has an incredible story. He suffered a stroke his senior year in high school, and they never thought he would, it was life-threatening. Never even play football again. He came up with a few sacks last year, a little bit undersized. He was rushing the playing time, but the talent is there, and I think he's a guy that you should watch for around Pitt.
All right, Joey, we mentioned off the top of your list, I believe it's 9 starters back there at Georgia Tech on defense. You guys look really strong. Any thoughts about the defensive front?
Yeah, definitely a lot of seniority on that defense, although I will say that maybe the other guy to watch that I didn't mention yet is actually going to be a true sophomore. That's Kashun Freeman. He was a freshman All-American last year, and I'll have to look it up. I think he had maybe about 6 sacks on the year or something. No, it's 4.5, excuse me. But did a very, very good job. A guy that I particularly was not expecting to be a starter, maybe a contributor, but probably a redshirt. Next thing you know, comes in and is the starter from day one, and honestly had a pretty good season. A guy that I have high expectations for moving forward. I think could be a very, very good guy, for his entire career. Not to mention does a lot of great things off the field as well. So he's a guy that I think a lot of us are excited there here in Atlanta.
Jeff, we've kicked this around a few times in past discussions about Carolina producing top 10 type NFL players, meaning that if you look at the top 10 or 15 schools in the country producing the most NFL players in the last 10 or 15 years, North Carolina would surprise some people in that 8 or 9 spot, and a lot of those guys are coming off the edge in past years, those type of players. Anybody we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I think this year we mentioned when we talked about cornerbacks, the guys that adjust and do what Gene Chizik wants quick and probably with the most consistency are the guys that are going to have a chance to show something. I think, their defensive line is going to be very young. In terms of snaps played, they were young last year, and so a lot of their depth is also young. But a few names to think about that are going to have a chance to do something special and kind of fit the mold of the guys previously that have been drafted from UNC in terms of defensive line. One is Nazir Jones. He fits he's got that NFL body already. He just needs to improve his consistency. I think part of the defensive changes and other guys coming into their own will help take some focus off of him so he can be a little more free. But he's a good athletic freak that I think will have a tremendous year under new coaching. The other one to think about is Tyler Powell. He was a guy last year that was a true freshman, and he was just a playmaker. Now, he suffered a high ankle sprain that nagged him all year. I think I said in the game, one of the games I'd like to forget against East Carolina, as bad as that game was going, he got through and sacked their quarterback Shane Carden and got hurt on the sack. Only in the UNC defense last year would actually get hurt on their best plays, and he goes in, finally gets a sack, but severely sprains his ankle on the same play, and he was kind of fighting that injury the rest of the year. He's another guy to look out for just because he's that high-energy, just physical defensive lineman. So I would say Jones and Powell. And then you've got to look out for true freshman Dalton if he gets a chance to get in the game. The guy's a physical specimen. But it's going to be, again, someone I think that we're not talking about now that adjusts quickly to what Chizik wants. Chizik's main thing that he wants is physicality. Everything he talks about is physicality. So the guys that are able to meet that or ring that bell for Chizik are the ones that are going to have a chance to make an impact.
Jeff, with a really good interview recently with Greg Ellis, who, of course, was a stud of a player at North Carolina, an All-American at defensive lineman, and also a long career in the NFL with the Raiders and the Cowboys. And everybody snickers when Jeff brings up North Carolina defense. Dan's chomping at the bit. All right, Dan, what do you got for us?
Well, I'm just laughing because I was about to say something about the fact that the best play the guy made for UNC resulted in him spraining his ankle, because we've had that for a couple of years at Boston College. So when you see that happen, that's like the guy who from the Detroit Lions who made the sack, stood up, celebrated, and then blew his knee out in like a 52-0 loss or whatever it was. So I was thinking about that. I wanted to be the one to say it, but he beat me to it.
All right, Dan, we're talking linebackers next. You probably will have something for us based on the recent history at BC, so we'll catch up with you then. Again, we got Dan Rubin of BC Interruption. We got Jim Hammett of Cardiac Hill. Jeff Greenberg of Sports Glutton, and, of course, it's Joey Weaver from the Rumble Seat. Guys, it was a good discussion here talking D-line in the ACC. Appreciate it.
You bet.